A warm welcome to the program today. I'm Amarachi Ubani. You're watching Diplomatic Channel. This week on the program, we have decided to explore the issue of morality and the war going on in Ukraine. The question of what right countries in the West and the United States have to term Russian President Vladimir Putin a war criminal, a butcher, when in reality, these countries have at some point in time taken similar actions. An article by Chris Hedges, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who worked for 15 years as foreign correspondent with the New York Times, titled "The Lie of American Innocence," identifies some high-profile Americans as war criminals who set up the legal framework to authorize torture, the helicopter pilots who gunned down civilians, and who have tried to silence those who have evidence of crimes they committed. He says in this article, if we demand justice for Ukrainians, as we should, we must also demand justice for the 1 million people killed, 400,000 of whom were non-combatants by American invasions, occupations and aerial assaults in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, and Pakistan. We must demand justice for those who were wounded, became sick or died because we destroyed hospitals and infrastructure. We must demand justice for the thousands of soldiers and Marines who were killed, and many more who were wounded and are living with lifelong disabilities in wars launched and sustained on lies. We must demand justice for the 38 million people who have been displaced or become refugees in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, the Philippines, Libya, and Syria, a number that exceeds a total of all those displaced in all wars since 1900, apart from World War II, according to the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. You can read the full article in sharepost.com. According to another article by Daily Philosophy titled "The Ukraine Conflict and the Ethics of War," there are 4 laws of war. Declaring and entering war, you ask questions such as, what are the good reasons to go to war? Are there better or worse reasons? The law during the war, where issues include, is it ever permissible to target civilians? Russia has been accused of targeting civilian populations under the guise of hitting military infrastructure or structures housing military hardware. And what if underage children take part in the war as armed soldiers? Now, that hasn't happened in the case of Ukraine, but we have seen cases in Angola, Burundi, the DRC, and a number of African countries. There's also the rules after the war, where you have to deal with questions such as how to end the war, how should the losing party be treated, how to deal with the return of prisoners and the wounded. History is usually written by the victor, and it's yet to be determined who the victor is in this story. In my interview with Professor Christopher Isike, we talk about the issues of morality in this war, scratching just the surface, but be sure it's an ongoing conversation. However, I begin with another conversation making the rounds, the role of Africa in the Ukraine war. Joining me now is Professor of African Politics, African Development and International Relations at the University of Pretoria, South Africa, Professor Christopher Isike. Professor Isike, thank you for joining me on the program.
Thank you, Amarachi, for having me, and good evening to your viewers.
Good evening, and let me begin with an argument that's been going on and off since this war started, and that is what Africa's role is in this, apart from having to evacuate her citizens stuck in cities where fighting has been going on since February 24th.
Well, yeah, you're correct. Africa has a stake in all of this. The war in Ukraine, following the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, affects Africa in many ways, because some African countries have historical relationships with Russia. Some are trading partners with Russia. Some countries buy oil from from Russia and Ukraine, and including, wheat and other grains that are much needed in Africa. So this war is already doing so, is going to increase the prices of these products, and that will affect Africa's economies in many ways. So it is also a conflict that is ideological in many ways. There's a contestation, some have said, between authoritarianism and democracy. And these debates, this clash, the clash between these two political systems, we're already seeing it playing out in some African states already, especially in West Africa, where democracy seems to be on the backslide. So these are aspects of the conflict that would affect Africa either way, especially if Russia, succeeds in its ambition to reestablish a bipolar world order, if you like, a multipolar world order made up of the United States, made up of Russia itself and China. That kind of world would have implications for Africa as well in terms of who to align with in a world that is, divided along spheres of influence. So these are some of the thoughts that I have around, how this conflict impacts Africa and how Africa should really think clearly about how to respond in terms of the ongoing conflict.
Now, some have talked about, the morality of this war and the morality in the war, how countries in the West are condemning Russia for doing what they themselves have done in Libya, in Syria, in the Middle East, Iraq, and so on. And yet they're trying to make themselves look like the good guys here in this instance. What do you think?
Well, yes, that's correct. That the West has behaved in this sort of way, disrespecting international law, international norms. You mentioned Iraq, you mentioned Syria. These are examples, and many critics of the West have used this whataboutism, as excuse for why Russia should, be, allowed to do what it is doing. But I think that it should go beyond that, because if this conflict, I've said elsewhere, provides a silver lining for the world and for Africa especially to push for a redefinition of the international system. One that will be more inclusive of geographies like Africa, and a world that will be more equitable, and a push for a reform of the United Nations Security Council, where countries would not just, it won't be for countries that are friends with one another, or countries that are there because of the power that they have. It should also recognize the power of demographics, so that countries like Nigeria, for example, should have very good reason why they should be part of that decision-making body, irrespective of what happens within Nigeria itself as a country. We've seen democracy also recede in the United States, for example. It has not stopped the United States from pushing for democracy, advancing democracy all over the world. So the fact that we have developmental problems does not mean that we cannot have a seat on the table on account of our population in the world alone. And of course, our importance, our strategic importance extends beyond that. But we need to see this conflict as an opportunity to push for a more fair international system that is actually inclusive, that is truly international, as the name implies. And a starting point would be, getting different regions of the world a seat on the table on account of representativity, not just of military power or economic power. And there are countries in the United Nations Security Council that are not even superpowers in any form, but they are in the United Nations Security Council. So those are some of the inequities in the global system that allow for this kind of behavior, by Russia, because it's been done before by the West. The West has tolerated it, and when Russia does it, it's legitimate when people say, but if the United States had done it, Russia should be able to do it, even though the pushback is that, well, the United States is so superpower, Russia is not. So these are, contending views. But my own position is simply that we have an international system that is not fair, that is racist, that is inequitable, and we must, as an African continent, come together and find ways to push for a redefinition of that world, either from the ashes of this war or from the ashes of a global world war, depending on what happens going forward.
When you're talking about, that international body, I suppose you're talking about the UN, and reforms in the UN have been spoken about, with each General Assembly. The UN has a Security Council. There's a secluded group, of course, with Russia as a member. Can the UN make any effective impact on this war, any effective resolution concerning the war in Ukraine with Russia being part of the Security Council?
No, it can't, and that's why it couldn't deter Russia in the first place. It couldn't even get a vote to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine in the United Nations Security Council. It could only do that in the UN General Assembly, and this is what I'm talking about: an international system that allows for a few countries, for whatever reasons, to sit around the table and decide the fate of others, billions of people that are not represented. And this is based on the logic of being and non-being, the racist being, categorization of the world into two zones of Europeans as beings who enjoy special privileges and non-Europeans, including Africans, as non-beings, non-human beings, who are an afterthought depending on the whims and caprices of the so-called beings. Until we have an international system where a human being, irrespective of your color or ethnicity, is a human being, and people are not grouped into regions based on their race, or based on the fact that every human being is equal and every human being deserves the enjoyment of rights and privileges that the world has to offer. That should be the logic, the ontological basis of an international system that will be equitable, that will be fair. And it's on that basis we can begin to ask the question of who is going to have a seat at the table where, the top table where, decisions will be made concerning how the world will be run. If some people take it as their right to decide for others, irrespective of who you are, we are going to keep having this kind of problem, especially when the situations like this and then confront them with being judges in their own courts. Then the question will be, where is the fairness? Where is the equity? And this is the point, really. The United Nations is crippled. It can do no more than pray and wish that Vladimir Putin changes his mind. And that's what you found the United Nations Security, the United Nations Secretary General do, appealing, pleading with Russia, to for the sake of people that are going to die from the conflict, not to go ahead with his aggression. It fell on deaf ears because, of course, Putin has, a much more broader strategy and purpose in terms of why he's doing what he's doing, which does not align with the moral, pleas of a toothless United Nations system.
And having this at the back of your mind, do you think that President Putin should face charges of war crimes when compared to how other world leaders have conducted themselves in almost similar situations?
Well, it depends. My answer would depend. If I'm to take a principled stance of what is good for the goose is good for the gander, then of course he should face that. But if I'm to pander to populist views around the world on why should he do that when we have war criminals like past presidents of the United States, then it will be difficult. But the point is, we should have a fair system that will enable anybody, whether you are president of the United States, president of Russia, president of China, or president of Nigeria or Ghana, make any one of these people face the consequence of their action, especially when they violate international law. Right now, the system is not fair, and so it's difficult to say Putin should face those charges when we know of people that have been accused, maybe not legally as Putin has now been done, accused, of war crimes. So my answer would be, it depends. It depends. If we are to have an international system that is fair to everyone, then of course it should. If the system has excused some special people in the past, there's no reason why people should not push for him to also evade, this particular accusation at this point in time.
Well, Russia is not signatory to the ICC, and neither is the United States. You mentioned the former president. Just before we go, Nigeria's Minister of State for Petroleum Resources, Timipre Silva, says Nigeria is ready to offer its services as an alternative gas supplier to Europe, urging the European Commission to increase investments in gas and hydrocarbons in Nigeria to enable the country meet the bloc's energy needs. You're talking about equality here, so what do you make of that?
Well, equality, every country has a right to protect its national interest, and in an international system that is realist, that is bereft of morality as a defining principle of foreign policy, Nigeria is within its rights to want to exploit the conflict, for its benefit, and that's what everybody does. So yes, Nigeria has what it takes to try and meet some of the needs of Europe in terms of gas, in terms of oil. So Nigeria is well within its right to call on Europe, because there is going to be a shortage as the world, fends off sanctions, the use of the use of Russian gas and oil. Eventually, there will be shortages all over the world, especially in Europe, that is highly dependent on Russian gas, for example. So they will be looking for alternative markets. The United States has pledged to provide that alternative, and there have been calls for Europe to also begin to take green energy more seriously. But in the interim, their needs have to be met, and they have to be met by other countries that are able to. So if Nigeria is able to do that, of course it should. But Nigeria, rather than expecting Europe to come help develop its capacity to serve Europe, should begin to look inwards and do what it needs to do. It's again marks of our default disposition, to be beggarly, to always look to Europe and America for things that we can do for ourselves. And this slavish colonialist mentality is a problem that we need to engage in at a time. At some point, if we have what it takes to supply the markets, our federal government, who sit every Wednesday in meetings, should be asking themselves, what can we do to expand our capacity to be able to make to benefit from this economically, and not wait for Europe to come and help develop the capacity, and then also begin to put terms in place that will further impinge on our sovereignty and our ability to decide for what is good or not good for ourselves.
Professor Christopher Isike, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for joining me on Diplomatic Channel.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we go, let's check in on other conversations in diplomatic circles.
Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has told U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken that it is important for President Joe Biden's administration to abide by the two-state solution, stopping settlements and the violence by settlers, preserve the historic status quo in Al-Aqsa, prevent unilateral action, reopen the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem, and cancel American laws that considered the PLO as a terrorist group that encourages incitement. He made the comment ahead of the Negev summit holding in a desert hotel in Israel. The The two-day summit in SDA Bulka will include the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain and Morocco, which were part of the so-called Abraham Accords brokered by the Trump administration in 2020 to normalize ties with Israel. Egypt's foreign minister, whose country on Saturday marked 43 years of peace with Israel, will also join the summit. The venue for the foreign ministers' meeting is where Israel's founding father and first Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion retired and is buried. The remote Negev Desert Farm Collective has long been a symbol of Israeli innovation. Meanwhile, the U.S. Secretary of State says the United States does not have a strategy for regime change in Russia. He was responding to questions on what President Biden said in his speech in Poland on Saturday, in which he said President Vladimir Putin could not remain in power and his war against Ukraine has been a strategic failure for Moscow.
With regard to the President's incredibly powerful speech yesterday, I think the President, the White House, made the point last night that, quite simply, President Putin cannot be empowered to wage war or engage in aggression against Ukraine or anyone else. As you know, and as you've heard us say repeatedly, we do not have a strategy of regime change in Russia or anywhere else for that matter. In this case, as in any case, it's up to the people of the country in question. It's up to the Russian people. But what we do have is a strategy to strongly support Ukraine. We've been doing that and rallying partners and allies around the world to do that.
Russia has promised to continue strikes with precision weapons against Ukrainian targets, while Ukraine claims that the Russian military operation has slowed. The Russian Defense Ministry says that Russian troops destroyed a large fuel base near a city of Lviv and the radio repair plant with precision-guided munitions, as well as missile depot in southwestern Kyiv with precision weapons on Saturday. Meanwhile, the head of the regional military administration confirmed that there were 3 explosions in the city. The powerful explosions occurred on the city's eastern outskirts. One of the attacks possibly hit a local oil storage facility, according to the Interfax Ukraine news agency, citing reports from social media. Russian troops struck 117 military facilities across Ukraine the previous day.
We've been pretty close now.
Finally, U.S. Special Envoy for Iran, Robert Malley, says that he is not confident that a nuclear deal between world powers and Iran is imminent after 11 months of talks in Vienna that have stalled. But Kamal Karazi, a senior advisor to Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, says a deal could come soon. He, however, points out that one sticking point is Washington's foreign terrorist organization designation against Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, an elite unit which reports to Khamenei.
It's imminent, but it depends on the political will of the United States. It was the United States which withdrew from the deal. IRGC is a national army, and a national army cannot be listed as terrorist group. And certainly it is not acceptable. That is very important for Iranians.
The sooner we get back into the deal, which is in our interest, and we presume in Iran's interest, the more faithfully we implement it, and the more we could build on it to address other issues between us and Iran and between Iran and the region, the longer, the more sustainable, the more solid, and the more mutually beneficial the deal will be.
This is where we end the program this week. Remember, you can watch this edition and others on our website. It's channelstv.com and on YouTube. I'm Amarachi Ubani. I'll see you next time.